Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller and today I'll be your companion on a gentle journey into sleep. Before we begin, take a deep breath, relax, and don't forget to support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Now lie back, close your eyes, and let this story guide you into a mysterious world filled with wonders, accompanied by the soft patter of rain in the background. That night, it was pouring rain. The heavy downpour pounded against the car windows, making it nearly impossible for me to see the road ahead. I was driving home after a long day at work, and the route I chose was a narrow road cutting through an old suburban neighborhood where most of the houses were worn down and abandoned. I had taken this road many times before, but this time, something felt different. The rain made the air around me feel cold and grim, and the dark houses along the road seemed to be swallowed by endless shadows. Only my headlights swept across each house, each blackened window like empty eyes staring at me, full of haunting silence. As I passed an old, decrepit house, I suddenly heard a knocking sound. The noise was clear and steady, even through the pounding rain. I flinched slightly, gripping the steering wheel tightly, my eyes fixed on the abandoned house by the roadside. It had been deserted for years, with shattered windows, peeling walls, and wild plants growing all around its entrance. I wasn't sure if I should stop, but something compelled me to. Maybe it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the strange sensation creeping into my mind. I decided to pull over to the side of the road, cut the engine, and listen. The knocking continued, steady and persistent, as if someone inside was waiting. The rain kept pouring, but I could hear the knocking clearly. This time, it didn't sound like just a knock. It had a sense of urgency, a hollow but insistent tone that made me feel I couldn't ignore it. I opened the car door, stepped out, and began walking slowly toward the house. Cold raindrops slapped my face and trickled down my neck, but I didn't stop. The headlights illuminated the front of the house, and in the dim light, I noticed the front door was slightly ajar. A chill and a sense of unease flooded over me, but my legs seemed to ignore me, drawing me closer. I stood at the door, my hand trembling as I lifted it, ready to knock back. But just then, the knocking suddenly stopped. An eerie silence fell over everything, broken only by the steady sound of rain hitting the porch roof. I swallowed, my heart pounding, and gently pushed the door open. The door creaked as it swung inward, and I stepped inside. The room was pitch dark, and a musty, damp smell filled the air, making me want to turn back and run, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. Something in this house was waiting for me. I took out my phone, turned on the flashlight, and shone it into the room. The weak beam swept over the empty space, illuminating old, dusty furniture covered in cobwebs. But no one was there. I stood still, feeling lost in the darkness of this house. Just as I was about to turn and leave, the knocking sounded again, this time from behind me. I turned around, shining the flashlight on the door I had just entered through, but no one was there. A chill ran down my spine, and I began to wonder if someone was playing a trick on me. I called out, "Is anyone here?" There was no answer, only the sound of rain outside. I steadied myself and decided to go deeper into the house. I walked through the living room and down a narrow hallway. The hallway led to another wooden door at the end. The knocking came again, this time from behind that wooden door. Each step I took made the floorboards creak, and in the dimness, the sound echoed from all directions. I slowly approached the wooden door, placed my hand on the doorknob, and took a deep breath before gently pushing it open. The door opened to reveal a small room, nearly empty except for a wooden table in the center. On the table lay an old notebook, its cover faded. I walked closer, my hand trembling as I opened it. Inside were scribbled notes, still legible. They were someone's journal entries, describing how they'd been trapped in this house, haunted by the endless knocking. The writer described the feeling of being watched, the growing fear that intensified with each nightfall, and the despair of finding no way out. I shivered as I read those words, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the page. Just as I was about to turn to the next page, the knocking sounded again, this time from right behind me. I whipped around, but the room was still empty. However, the door had somehow closed on its own, and I suddenly felt trapped with no way out. My chest tightened, my heart racing, and just then I heard a faint voice behind me. "Don't let them in." The voice was weak, barely more than a whisper in the air, freezing me in place. I turned, but there was no one there. In a panic, I rushed toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. The knocking began again, louder and more insistent, as if someone was desperately trying to break through. I screamed, pleading for someone to help, but my voice was swallowed by the rain outside. Desperately, I glanced back at the notebook, hoping to find a clue that could help me escape. On the very last page, I saw a hastily scrawled message, the handwriting shaky as though written in sheer desperation. "If you're reading this, get out before it's too late. Don't let them in." At that moment, the door burst open with a powerful force, and a frigid wind swept into the room, scattering the pages of the notebook. I bolted from the room, determined to escape this haunted house, but I felt as though something was following my every step. I ran down the hallway, through the living room, and finally reached the front door. The rain outside was still pouring down, but to me, it was the only path to safety. I rushed outside, the rain pelting my face, and sprinted toward my car. As soon as I got inside, I started the engine, not daring to look back even once, and sped away from that place. On the drive home, I struggled to calm myself, but the fear lingered. I thought of the notebook and those final words, a desperate warning from someone who had gone through the same terror. Questions flooded my mind. Who or what was inside that house, and what was behind the knocking? Though I had no answers, I knew I would never go back to that house again. But just as I thought it was all over, I suddenly noticed something horrifying. The old notebook was lying on the back seat, as if it had followed me, carrying all the dreadful secrets from that abandoned house. After that terrifying night with the relentless knocking from the abandoned house, I couldn't shake the memory of what I'd experienced. The mysterious notebook on my back seat became an obsession, as though it carried a lingering shadow from that forsaken place. Despite my attempts to get rid of it, every time I looked back, the notebook was there, an invisible reminder that I couldn't escape the story. I decided to get far away from it all, hoping to clear my mind and find some peace. A friend suggested a small town where he worked as the security manager for an old theater. The theater was a beautiful colonial-era building that hadn't been in use for years. People claimed it was haunted by the spirit of an actor who had passed away there many years ago, but I didn't buy into those stories. After everything, all I wanted was a quiet place to rest. The theater stood on the edge of town, with its red brick walls covered in moss and weathered statues adorning the facade. I met my friend at the entrance, and he greeted me with a smile, guiding me inside. "You can stay here for a few nights if you want, but I should warn you, this place has a few ghost stories," he joked, but I only gave a half-hearted laugh. Inside, the theater's vast, dimly lit space stretched out before me, with rows of dust-covered seats facing an old stage. Everything seemed frozen in time, creating a somber and chilly atmosphere. I tried not to dwell on the ghost stories he mentioned, just eager to find some respite from the haunting memory of that notebook. On my first night at the theater, everything was eerily quiet. The wind howled through cracks in the doors, water dripped from rusty pipes, and the creaking of old seats filled the space with a chilling atmosphere. I lay down on a bench backstage, trying to close my eyes and drift off, but it felt like someone was watching me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps from up in the audience seating. At first, I thought it was my friend doing his rounds, but these footsteps were heavy and slow, as if someone was pacing deliberately, weaving through each row of seats. In the stillness, the sound echoed clearly, unsettling me. I sat up, holding my breath and listening. Rain began to patter outside, adding a soft drip as water spilled over the old rooftop. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was so intense that I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my chest. I told myself I was probably just on edge after everything that had happened, trying to ignore the sounds and go back to sleep. But at that moment, a dark figure passed across the distant end of the auditorium, gliding through the rows of seats like a faint mist. It had no clear shape, but I felt an odd, chilling presence fill the room. I sat upright, goosebumps rising all over. This time I knew I hadn't imagined it. I grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the seating, but all I saw were empty, dust-covered chairs bathed in darkness. A heavy, oppressive air seemed to press down on me, as though something unseen was watching my every move. Then, out of nowhere, a soft laugh echoed from behind the stage, a cold, eerie sound that felt as if it came from another world. I pointed my flashlight toward the source of the laugh, but saw nothing. My heart raced, fear flooding over me. I decided I couldn't stay there alone any longer and turned to leave, hoping to find my friend. But when I reached the exit, I realized the door was locked. I tried pulling it hard, but it wouldn't budge, and at that moment, I understood I was trapped in the theater with some unseen force. The footsteps started up again, this time behind me. I turned around and the shadow appeared again, this time moving closer. My flashlight illuminated its vague shape, only adding to its terror. It stood still, seemingly watching me, then slowly lifted a misty arm and pointed toward the stage. For reasons I couldn't explain, I felt drawn to the gesture, and my legs started to move toward the stage, even as my mind screamed at me to run. I climbed onto the stage, my flashlight casting a narrow beam into the empty space ahead. But the moment my feet touched the stage, the sound of applause rose from the audience. The clapping grew louder, as though hundreds of people were seated below applauding me. But as I looked down, the seats were still empty, only shadows and rows of dusty chairs. I froze, a chill spreading through me. The applause abruptly stopped, and an eerie silence fell over the theater. I turned to step off the stage, but a figure suddenly appeared before me. A man dressed in old-fashioned theater attire, his face pale, his eyes hollow. He took slow, deliberate steps toward me, and I could feel an icy chill radiate from him. In a panic, I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I tried to back away, but my legs felt as though they were rooted to the stage. The man stopped a few feet away, his voice low but laced with bitter resentment. "You're here to continue my story, aren't you?" I didn't understand what he meant, but in his eyes, I sensed deep sorrow, and the fury of a spirit denied rest. He gestured toward the seats, and I saw faint shadows seated in rows, silently watching us from the darkness. They didn't move. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes, dark, hollow pits, stared straight at me. "You're here to finish my story," he repeated, his voice cutting through the air, each word like a blade. "You will stand on this stage as I once did." I shook my head, trying to protest, but I couldn't make a sound. He moved closer, his eyes filled with rage and despair. "They've forgotten me," he said, his voice fractured, like a lament. "But you cannot. You must remember. You must tell this story until they remember." For a moment, I felt as though I were being drawn into his hollow gaze, into a well of agonizing memories and silent screams. Images flashed in my mind, a tragic final performance, the stage lights going dark, the audience fleeing in terror, and the man, alone on stage in his costume, left to a silence that would never end. I tried to back away, desperate to escape his tormented stare, but he stepped closer, tightening his grip. Then, suddenly, he grasped my shoulders, his cold, icy hands holding me in place. "Every night, you will return here to tell my story until someone listens," he whispered, and the darkness around me grew thicker, enveloping me. "You will become me until I am freed." With those words, all the stage lights blazed on, flooding the theater. I found myself surrounded by hundreds of shadowy figures sitting quietly in the seats, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. Invisible hands seemed to bind me to the stage, as though I'd become part of this cursed performance. Then, a single clap rang out, slow and deliberate. The sound echoed through the theater, and soon all the shadowy figures joined in, their applause chilling and relentless, as if mocking me from another world. As I felt myself slipping into pure panic, the lights began to flicker. Then everything went dark. I was left standing alone, hearing the rain outside as it echoed distantly, pulling me back to reality. When I finally came to, I found myself lying on the stage floor, the theater cold and eerily silent. My friend rushed over, looking worried as he saw me. "What are you doing here? Why are you on stage?" he asked. I couldn't answer, only shook my head, trembling. But as I stepped down from the stage, I heard a whisper in my mind, the voice of the forgotten actor, still lingering. "You'll come back every night. The story never ends." I walked out of the theater, but I knew the darkness and the memory of that final performance would haunt me like a role I could never escape. After the haunting nights at the old theater, I decided to leave town and drive out to a remote countryside area known for its vast lake where people often camp. Some say that when the weather turns, if you're lucky, or perhaps unlucky, you might see the ghostly outline of an old ship rising from the lake's depths. It's said to be a ghost ship that once carried many passengers during a storm decades ago before it sank, with no survivors. The souls of those lost are rumored to linger within the lake, unable to find peace. Curious, I decided to test my luck. By then, I thought I had witnessed enough strange things that one more ghost story wouldn't faze me. I arrived at the lake in the afternoon and set up camp along the shore with a group of new friends I'd just met there. That evening, the sky suddenly darkened and rain began to pour. We gathered inside the tent, listening to the heavy drops hitting the canvas, a sound that felt oddly calming yet carried an eerie undertone. As night fell, the rain intensified, and the wind stirred up waves on the lake's surface. One of the guys, who seemed to know a lot about the legend of the ghost ship, started recounting the tale. He explained that the ship's final voyage was doomed from the start. On that night, as everyone celebrated aboard, a storm hit without warning. There had been prior alerts, but the ship's captain, eager to make the trip perfect, ignored them and set sail anyway. The ship and all its passengers were lost, destined to remain at the bottom of the lake forever. The atmosphere grew tense as he continued, telling us that on stormy nights, some claimed to see faint lights from beneath the water and hear the distant sounds of music, a ghostly party that never ends. One of our friends joked about going down to the lake to see for ourselves, half in jest, but I could tell we were all a little spooked after hearing the story. Still, we decided to head outside, maybe out of curiosity or just to prove that there was really nothing to be afraid of. We grabbed our flashlights and stepped out of the tent, following a narrow trail down to the lake. The rain continued to pour, cold and heavy. Our flashlights barely cut through the darkness, surrounded by a thick mist and the relentless sound of rain hitting the lake's surface. As we reached the shore, we stood silently, waiting for something unusual to happen. At first, there were only small ripples on the lake, reflecting our lights as tiny glimmering sparks. But then, from beneath the water, a faint glow appeared, flickering like a candle in the wind. We all fell silent, staring at that light. It pulsed a few times, then vanished. One of us whispered, "Did that light come from the ship?" No one answered. We stood there tense, and then a soft sound, almost like distant music, drifted up from the depths of the lake. It was barely audible, but we all heard it. A strange, gentle melody that seemed to echo from far away, from a time long buried in the past. "It sounds like dance music," someone said, their voice trembling. Just then, a strong wind blew across the lake, stirring the dark waves into a frenzy. In the shifting water, we suddenly caught a glimpse of a ship, appearing ghostly and faint. It was there for only a second, then vanished like an illusion. The ship was long, with torn sails and a weathered hull. Figures stood on the deck, faded, almost transparent passengers, like specters, gathered on the ship's deck, their hollow eyes gazing toward us. We held our breath, unable to look away. The ship bobbed in the mist, its faint glow flickering on and off, as if the passengers were attending an endless, spectral party. The music grew clearer, and we could make out soft laughter mixed with the murmurs of the passengers. No one dared to move. We were all frozen, entranced by the strange vision. Then suddenly, one of the figures on the ship turned toward us, and in the dim light, I saw its eyes, dark, bottomless, filled with resentment and sorrow. The man on the ship's deck raised his hand, pointing directly at us. For a moment, I felt like he was beckoning us, inviting us to join them in their endless, cursed celebration. As if drawn by an unseen force, I took a step toward the lake, ignoring my friend's frightened shouts behind me. My legs felt hypnotized, compelled to move closer to that ghostly ship, to become part of the haunting dance of lost souls. But just as I reached the water's edge, a loud scream from one of my friends snapped me out of the trance. The ship began to sink, its ghostly outline fading into the dark depths, taking with it the flickering lights and the eerie music. The shadowy figures on board slowly disappeared, and within seconds, everything vanished. Only the still, dark surface of the lake remained, as though nothing had ever happened. We stood there trembling, unsure of what to say. Part of me wanted to believe it was all just an illusion, but the chill lingering in my bones and the haunting gaze of the man on the ship told me otherwise. Perhaps those souls truly are trapped down there, never finding peace, forever locked in a lost celebration beneath the lake. None of us slept that night. The music, the faint lights, and the ghostly passengers on the ship lingered in our minds, a chilling reminder that sometimes the past refuses to rest, and lost souls still linger in places beyond our sight. The next morning, when the rain had stopped and the lake was calm again, we left quickly, but I knew the image of that ghost ship beneath the lake would haunt me forever, an unsolved mystery lingering in the depths. After my encounter with the ghost ship at the bottom of the lake, everything around me started to feel strange and surreal. Things I once considered mere legends now seemed to be coming to life, and it felt like I was caught in an endless spiral of eerie, supernatural tales. I decided to continue my journey, hoping to find a sense of peace after everything I'd experienced. Looking for a quiet place to rest, I drove to a small mountain town. As evening approached and a light drizzle began, I spotted an old roadside inn. The inn looked worn and aged, with an architecture reminiscent of a bygone era. The sign hung loosely under the awning, its dim yellow light glowing warmly through the rainy darkness, giving off a feeling that was both welcoming and mysterious. I parked outside, turned off the engine, and stepped inside. The reception desk was tucked in a corner of the lobby, behind which sat a dusty shelf and a few antique paintings on the wall. An elderly woman stood behind the desk, her face calm and composed, greeting me with a faint smile. She looked at me with an odd expression, as if she had been expecting me. "I need a room for the night," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though a sense of unease crept over me as I took in the surroundings. The woman nodded, handing me the key to room 7. She pointed toward the end of the hallway, speaking in a hushed tone, as if she feared someone might overhear. "The last room, but be careful." Her warning puzzled me, but I didn't press further. After my recent experiences, I was too exhausted to dwell on vague remarks. I took the key and headed down the dimly lit hallway, each step echoing softly in the eerie silence. The room was at the end of the hallway, and the faint glow from the hallway lights made everything look washed out and gloomy. The door's paint was chipped, and the doorknob felt ice cold. I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was modestly furnished with a double bed, an old armchair, and a small bedside lamp. As soon as I stepped in, a chill filled the room, an almost unnatural cold that settled deep into my bones. I shut the door behind me and sat down on the bed, exhausted, wanting nothing more than to close my eyes and forget all the strange encounters that had led me here. But just as I closed my eyes, a soft knock echoed from the door. I opened my eyes, startled. At first I thought I might have imagined it, but the knock came again, steady and slow. I got up and walked over to the door, opening it to find nothing. The hallway was empty, dark, and silent, with no one in sight. I returned to the bed, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But as I lay down again, the knocking returned, this time louder, as if someone were urgently trying to get in. A sense of dread seeped into my skin, raising goosebumps as the chill deepened. Looking around, I noticed the dim glow of the bedside lamp, casting thick shadows into the corners of the room, almost as if they were closing in on me. This time, instead of opening the door, I listened carefully. The knocking continued, but it wasn't coming from the door. It was coming from the wall directly behind the bed. My heart raced. I sat up quickly, trying to listen more intently. The knocking grew louder, as though someone were trapped behind the wall, desperately trying to get my attention. A horrifying thought crossed my mind. Could someone really be trapped in this room? Or was it the spirit of someone who hadn't yet found peace? Just then, the bedside lamp flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. In that moment, I felt trapped, struggling to breathe as the knocking grew more frantic. Suddenly, a whisper came from somewhere in the room, soft but chilling. "Help me. Don't leave me here." The voice made my skin crawl, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I didn't know what to do, standing there trying to steady myself. And then, in the faint light cast by the rain outside filtering through the window, I saw a shadowy figure sitting in the old armchair. He was a man, his gaze hollow, staring right through me. Dressed in worn-out clothes, his face was pale and his eyes sunken, as if he had witnessed countless horrors. My entire body froze, unable to move, trapped by the hypnotic pull of his empty stare. "I am the last guest," he murmured, his voice soft yet filled with sorrow. "They left me here. No one could hear me. No one remembers me." His words echoed in my mind, stirring a profound sense of despair and loneliness. I realized he was a forgotten spirit, trapped in this room for decades, unable to find peace. Summoning all my courage, I asked him, "What do you need? Is there something I can do to help you?" He looked at me, eyes full of anguish. "You have to remember me. Don't let me vanish as though I never existed." And with that, his form faded away. The bedside lamp flickered back on, and the room returned to its normal state, as though nothing had happened. But I knew it wasn't an illusion. His words lingered in my mind, a desperate plea from a lonely, forgotten soul. The next morning, as I was leaving the inn, I stopped by the reception desk and asked the elderly woman about the last guest in room 7. She looked at me thoughtfully, sighed, and explained that years ago, a man had stayed in room 7 but mysteriously disappeared. No one knew what had happened to him, and ever since, the room had been regarded as one no one dared to stay in for long. I left the inn with a heavy heart. Although I didn't fully understand the man's story, I knew I had become part of his memory, a witness to the life he once had. I promised myself I would never forget his empty, sorrowful gaze, the last guest of room 7. But that night, as I got into my car and glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw his faint silhouette in the back seat, his eyes still filled with loneliness. I understood then that, even after leaving that room, his spirit would follow me, a reminder that once entangled in the world of lost souls, there is no true escape. After the terrifying night at the inn where I encountered the spirit of the last guest, a lingering fear shadowed my every step. Each story I lived through felt like fragments of an unending nightmare, blurring the line between reality and illusion. Hoping to escape these haunting memories, I decided to venture into a forest on the outskirts of town, a place I'd heard was ideal for rest and tranquility. That morning, as I approached the forest, the sky was clear and the air refreshing. I believed this trip would finally be the chance to shake off the eerie encounters I'd been through. To ensure privacy, I chose a small trail leading into the woods, winding toward a secluded area less frequented by others. However, as I ventured deeper, the weather changed suddenly. Dark clouds gathered from nowhere, and a light drizzle began to fall, making the air feel cold and damp. I wasn't overly concerned. I had prepared thoroughly for this trip, bringing along rain gear and a flashlight. But the further I went, the more unsettling everything felt. The trees around me grew denser, the path started to fade, and the surroundings seemed to close in, filling me with a sense of claustrophobia and isolation. Deciding it was time to turn back, I retraced my steps, but the familiar path I had taken had vanished, replaced by a dense, dark, unfamiliar section of the forest. A wave of anxiety rose within me, but I tried to remain calm. I thought I could find my way back if I kept walking, but with each step, the forest seemed to grow more tangled and confusing. The rain intensified, soaking through my clothes and blurring everything around me. A thick fog began to settle in, shrouding the area and making it hard to see even a few feet ahead. I turned on my flashlight, but its beam barely pierced the murky air. The trees loomed like shadowy figures in the darkness, and I felt as if countless eyes were watching me from every direction. In my panic, I heard a faint sound somewhere in the forest, a light, deliberate set of footsteps, unmistakably not my own. The steps seemed to draw closer, one by one. I turned around, but saw nothing but the thick trunks of blackened trees and the dense darkness. Suddenly, a soft whisper echoed nearby, a deep, distant voice. "You will never find your way out." My heart clenched, and each step felt heavier. I tried to shout, to dispel the fear gripping me, but my voice was drowned out by the rain and the wind rustling through the leaves. I began to run, not knowing where I was headed, only knowing that I needed to escape this place as fast as possible. But no matter how far or fast I ran, the forest seemed endless, the paths leading nowhere, only looping back to the same spot. In my frantic dash, I tripped and fell, my flashlight slipping from my grasp and rolling out of reach. Darkness instantly engulfed me. I struggled to pick up the flashlight, but my hands were trembling uncontrollably. When I finally managed to turn it on, I found myself facing a large, twisted tree root with an eerie shape. It looked like a grotesque face, with hollow eye sockets and a gaping mouth twisted in a mocking grin. Just then, the whisper returned, closer this time, clearer. "There is no escape from this forest. Those who enter are doomed to remain." The words echoed in my mind, like a haunting curse. The sensation of being trapped, of being crushed within an inescapable space, left me in utter despair. I closed my eyes, telling myself this was just a nightmare, that when I opened my eyes, everything would be gone. But when I opened them, I saw the figure of a man standing in the distance, shrouded by the mist. The man wore old, faded clothes, his form ghostly and blurred. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his gaze seemed to lock directly onto mine. I felt mesmerized, unable to look away. He raised a hand, beckoning me to come closer. I stood frozen, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to run far away from him, but another part felt irresistibly drawn to that gaze. I took cautious steps toward him, like a moth to a flame. But as I got closer, the man suddenly vanished, leaving me alone in the dark forest. I stood there trying to steady my breathing, but then I heard footsteps again, this time from multiple directions, as though dozens of people were moving around me. Yet no one appeared. Whispers echoed from every direction, faint but haunting words. "This forest is our home. You will never leave here. We have been waiting for so long." The whispers rose together, forming a chilling harmony, like the voices of countless lost souls echoing through the woods. I screamed, but my voice was swallowed by the rain. Desperation took over, and I began to run, no longer caring about direction, only hoping to escape. After what felt like an eternity, I spotted a faint light in the distance. It was a glimmer of hope, and I sprinted toward it, no longer thinking, just following the light. As I drew closer, I saw it was a small cottage, with a soft glow streaming from its window. I rushed to the door, banging hard, hoping someone would open and save me from this nightmare. The door slowly creaked open, and I saw an elderly woman standing inside, her gaze gentle but filled with an inexplicable sorrow. "Come in," she said softly. "You shouldn't wander this forest alone." I stepped inside, feeling a small sense of relief. The woman looked at me with understanding eyes, as if she already knew everything I had endured. She didn't say anything further, only quietly prepared a cup of hot tea for me. As I sat down, I recounted everything I had experienced: the whispers, the figure of the man, the overwhelming feeling of being trapped in a forest with no way out. The woman listened, nodding sympathetically, then spoke in a gentle tone. "This forest was once a peaceful place, but lost souls have turned it into somewhere no one dares to go." She explained that those who got lost in this forest would become part of it, held back by the spirits of those who had perished, never able to return. When I asked why she was here, she only gave a sad smile and didn't answer. After finishing my tea, I felt an unexpected drowsiness, a heavy sleepiness creeping over me. She pointed me to a small room to rest, and slowly I drifted into sleep. The next morning when I awoke, I found myself lying beneath a large tree in the middle of the forest. Sunlight filtered through the branches, and the forest looked entirely different from the night before. There was no ominous darkness, no chilling whispers, nor any sign of the strange man. Startled, I sat up, trying to recall what had happened. The small cottage, the elderly woman, and her story about the lost souls. But as I looked around, there was no trace of the house or the woman. Only a serene silence filled the space around me. I stood up, still a bit disoriented, and tried to find my way out of the forest. This time, the path seemed much clearer, and I quickly found a trail that led me back. As I walked through the morning sunlight, everything around me looked peaceful and calm, a stark contrast to the terror of the previous night. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I saw a group of locals gathered nearby. They looked at me with curious eyes, and one of them approached, asking, "Are you all right? No one dares to go into that forest at night." I shared part of my story with them, mentioning how I had gotten lost, found the small cottage, and met the elderly woman who had helped me. As soon as I mentioned her, I noticed their expressions shift to something serious. One of them spoke up, voice filled with astonishment and fear. "That woman passed away over 30 years ago. She was the last person to live here, and the only one who truly knew the forest's mysteries." According to their tale, she had been a kind soul who often helped people lost in the woods, but one night, she mysteriously disappeared and was never seen again. The villagers believe her spirit remains in the forest, guiding those who stumble in, helping them find their way back out. I was speechless as I listened, realizing I had been saved by her spirit. Gratitude and fear intertwined within me as I left the forest, saying a silent prayer for the woman's soul, hoping she would find the peace she deserved. From that day on, I knew I'd never dare return to that forest. I understood that some secrets, souls, and stories dwell in its shadows, mysteries that might never be solved. And though I had escaped, the whispers from that night would forever linger in my memory, reminding me that there are places not meant for the living to tread. After escaping the forest with no way out, thanks to the help of the mysterious woman, I thought everything would return to normal. But it seemed my life had become entangled in an endless chain of horror stories. Each step felt as if it were drawing me closer to inexplicable and eerie phenomena I couldn't understand. One evening, with rain threatening to fall, I drove to another rural area, hoping for some peace. The road I chose passed over an old bridge, surrounded only by fields and dense shrubs. As I approached the bridge, light rain began to drizzle, and my car's headlights illuminated the wet, dimly lit road ahead. I intended to drive across without stopping, but my lights caught a figure standing under the bridge. It was a tall, thin man in old clothes, standing silently, staring into the distance. I wasn't sure if he had noticed my headlights since he didn't turn, nor did he show any sign of awareness of my presence. Curiosity mixed with a hint of unease prompted me to stop the car. I thought perhaps he needed help, or might be a homeless person seeking shelter from the rain. I turned off the engine, stepped out of the car, and quickly walked toward the bridge, trying to stay as dry as possible. As I got closer, I noticed something strange about him. His stance was eerily still, his head slightly lowered, and his gaze fixed on the small river flowing beneath the bridge, as if waiting for something. "Hello, do you need any help?" I called out, but he didn't respond, remaining frozen in place. I repeated the question, but this time, my voice seemed to be swallowed by the sound of rain and flowing water. A shiver ran through me, but I stepped closer to get a better look at his face. As I drew near, I realized something chilling. His face bore no expression, his eyes empty and lifeless, as if he were devoid of any life. Suddenly he spoke, his voice distant and hollow. "She promised she'd come back, but I'm still waiting." I shuddered at his words. Who was this she he mentioned? Why was he waiting under this bridge? I didn't know how to respond, but in that moment, I looked into those vacant eyes and felt a profound sorrow, a hopeless, endless weight. "She's been gone for so long," he murmured, as if speaking to himself. "But I know she'll return someday." His words hung in the air, lost in the somber atmosphere, with the steady rhythm of the rain amplifying the loneliness surrounding him. Trying to maintain my composure, I asked, "How long have you been waiting here?" He looked at me with a dazed expression, as if he didn't quite understand the question. He didn't answer immediately, but whispered instead, "Long enough to forget everything, except her." I felt a growing sense of unease, realizing that he no longer belonged to this world. He was a trapped soul, a ghost waiting for a promise that would never be fulfilled. Suddenly, the man stepped out from under the bridge and moved toward the riverbank where raindrops fell onto the cold water. In that moment, I watched as his figure began to fade, almost as if he were dissolving into the rain. He turned back to look at me one last time, his eyes filled with desolation and despair. "She will come back, I know. I know she will." With those final words, he disappeared entirely, leaving me standing alone under the bridge in the cold, rainy night. I felt an indescribable sadness and loneliness, as if I had just witnessed a story of unfulfilled love, an endless wait with no conclusion. As I returned to my car, I couldn't stop thinking about him and his story. I had the sense that even though I'd left the bridge, he would remain there, waiting through every rainy night for someone who would never return. And from that day forward, whenever it rained, I'd remember his hollow gaze and wonder. How many other souls in this world are waiting in vain, trapped between two realms, unable to let go and unable to move on? The horror stories I encountered seemed to follow me endlessly, giving me no chance to find peace. After meeting the lonely man waiting under the bridge, I left the suburbs, hoping to escape those haunting experiences by returning to the city. But as if drawn by an invisible force toward mysterious and eerie happenings, I found myself stumbling into yet another story, this time at an abandoned apartment complex on the city's outskirts. That night, it was raining steadily, and cold winds swept through the empty streets. I looked for a temporary place to rest, and spotted the old apartment building standing quietly amidst the cityscape. The complex had been abandoned for years, with broken windows, peeling paint, and walls overgrown with moss, bearing the unmistakable marks of time. Built in the 1960s, it had once been a bustling residence, but a mysterious event had left it forsaken ever since. I never imagined I'd step foot in such a place, but curiosity pushed me closer, and before I realized it, I was standing at the building's entrance. The dim streetlight cast a gloomy glow on the mossy walls, making the complex appear even more ominous. I shivered, but a faint noise from within the building made me freeze in place, listening closely. It was a soft sound, like the careful footsteps of someone sneaking around, then stopping somewhere in the dark hallway. I took a few more steps, trying to listen more intently. The rain outside only seemed to amplify the eerie silence within. My flashlight's beam illuminated the creaky staircase leading upward, flickering slightly, heightening my sense of unease. As I ventured further in, a cold draft swept through, carrying the musty scent of dampness mixed with something peculiar, like the stale odor of old smoke and dust. I realized that this apartment had once been a warm home, a place filled with life, but now it was merely a ghost of its past. Suddenly, from the floor above, a faint whisper echoed, so soft it was nearly inaudible, but dark and distant. I instinctively stepped back, fear swelling in my chest. A single thought echoed in my mind. Is someone up there? The curiosity, along with a hint of defiance, made me decide to go up. Each stair I stepped on creaked, as if they could no longer bear the weight after all these years. As I reached the second floor, the whispering grew louder, coming from one of the apartments deep in the shadowy hallway. Don't leave me." The whisper was soft yet sorrowful, like the plea of someone lost. I followed the sound, trying to locate its source. The hallway was long and narrow, with old wooden doors all closed tightly, but everything in this space felt lifeless. When I reached apartment 23, the whisper abruptly stopped. I stood there, unsure of what to do next. The door to apartment 23 looked worn, with peeling paint and a rusted handle, as if untouched for years, but something compelled me to reach for the handle and twist it gently. The door creaked open slowly. Inside, my flashlight illuminated a small, dark room filled with dust and cobwebs. The furniture was still in place, as though the occupants had only left yesterday. By the window stood an old armchair, and on the table was a faded family photo showing a woman and a small girl. My heart clenched as I gazed at the photo. There was something hauntingly familiar, as if I'd seen these people somewhere before. Just then, I heard slow footsteps approaching from behind me. I turned, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but saw no one. A chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the whisper returned, this time right behind me, a desperate, pleading voice. "Don't leave me. Here." I spun around, and in the weak beam of my flashlight, I saw a figure. A woman, her face pale and her eyes hollow. She stood silently, watching me as if trying to convey something. She didn't appear threatening, but her eyes held immense sorrow and despair, the gaze of a forgotten soul. We stood in silence, and for a moment, I felt an overwhelming sadness emanating from her. She had the look of someone who had been left behind, waiting endlessly. It was as if she were bound to this place, a spirit unable to move on, clinging to a life that had slipped away long ago. Why are you still here?" I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper. But she remained silent, only looking at me with that haunting, empty stare. A wave of guilt washed over me, and I felt an inexplicable urge to reach out, to somehow comfort her. But before I could say or do anything, she began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows. As she vanished, her whisper lingered in the air, filled with an indescribable loneliness. "Don't forget me." And then she was gone, leaving me alone in the cold, dark apartment. I stood there, shaken, as the silence closed in, and the room felt colder than ever. Slowly, I backed out of the room, pulling the door shut behind me. With each step down the stairs, I felt the weight of her sorrow, a pain that seemed to cling to me like the dampness of the rain. When I finally returned to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her had stayed with me. As I drove away, the rain continued to fall, tapping softly on the windows, and I found myself haunted by her last words. I knew that wherever she was, she'd still be waiting, her soul trapped in that forgotten apartment. And from that night on, every time I passed by an abandoned building, I couldn't help but wonder how many souls were left waiting, lost in the spaces between worlds, hoping for someone to remember them. I didn't know what to do, but in that moment, I felt her endless loneliness. She didn't say anything more. She simply looked at me, her lips moving as if to speak, but no words came. I wanted to ask, to understand her story, but in an instant her form faded, leaving me alone in the cold, empty room. Outside, the rain continued its steady rhythm, like the quiet weeping of the forgotten apartment. I glanced once more at the photo on the table, feeling a profound sadness wash over me. Leaving the room, I descended the stairs, burdened by the thought that she was a soul trapped in time, forever waiting for something or someone who would never return. When I reached the outside, I turned back to look at the abandoned building, imagining her figure still standing by the window, her eyes full of sorrow gazing out. Though I had left, her image and desperate whispers remained with me, an indelible mark that I couldn't erase. From that day on, I understood that in every dark corner of this city, there were lost souls waiting, bound to promises that would never be fulfilled and pains that would never be soothed. Rainy nights seemed to always bring me encounters with things not of this world. After leaving the abandoned apartment and the haunting gaze of the woman there, I thought I needed to find another place to escape the terrifying memories. But perhaps once again, fate was pulling me into an endless, ghostly tale. That night, I passed by an old cemetery on the outskirts of the city. The rain poured down heavily, the drops merging with the cold, damp air of the graveyard. The dimly lit path was deserted, save for the wind that whistled through the rows of trees lining the road, as if recounting forgotten stories from hundreds of years past. My car's headlights illuminated the narrow path through the cemetery. From a distance, I saw a faint figure standing silently by an old grave. It was a woman in a wedding dress, her long hair flowing down, and her white gown fluttered lightly in the wind and rain. The sight made me stop, unsure of what I was witnessing. I slowed the car, the headlights casting flickering beams onto the figure. At first, I thought she might just be someone visiting a grave, but the way she stood there, motionless, unresponsive, sent a chill down my spine. Unable to resist my curiosity, I pulled the car to the side of the road, turned on my flashlight, and decided to approach her. As I got closer, I realized something was strange about this bride. Her wedding dress was old and tattered, her bare feet standing in a cold puddle. Her long, jet-black hair was drenched, covering part of her face. I spoke, trying to keep my voice steady. Do you need any help?" The woman remained silent, standing as still as before, her gaze fixed on the grave in front of her. Almost instinctively, I shone my flashlight toward the grave, where the name Anna was engraved, along with a wedding date, a day in October many years ago. In that instant, I realized she was standing before her own grave. Suddenly, the woman turned her head, her eyes locking onto mine. Her gaze was deep, hollow, and lifeless. Yet I could feel the pain and despair within them. Her face wore a sorrowful expression, as if burdened by an indescribable anguish. "I'm waiting for him," she whispered, her voice as soft as a breeze but heavy with sadness. "Who is he?" I asked, though I had an uneasy feeling about the answer. "My husband," she replied, her voice fractured, as though she was struggling to remember distant memories. He promised he'd come back, but I've been waiting. All these years. Her words seemed to transcend time, drawing me back to a moment buried deep in the past. I imagined this bride standing here on her wedding day, waiting for someone who perhaps would never return. I didn't know what to say to console her, but I felt a strong urge to help her find peace. "Is there something I can do to help you?" I asked gently. The woman looked at me in silence, not responding. After a moment, she lowered her head, her slender shoulders trembling, as if she were crying. In the cold rain, the image of the lonely woman crying beside her own grave was haunting, and I felt a heavy sadness pressing down on my heart. As I was about to turn to leave, the bride suddenly spoke. "Tell him, I'm still waiting." Her words made me pause, but I had no idea where to find her husband, or even if he was still alive, or if he had left this world long ago. I turned back to look at her, but in an instant, her figure had vanished into the night rain, leaving only the solitary grave with its fading inscription. I left the cemetery in a daze. Her story haunted me, and that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her hollow gaze, her lonely figure standing in her soaked wedding dress under the rain, waiting for someone she knew would never return. In the days that followed, I tried to find information about the mysterious bride, but all I discovered was a faded news clipping from many years ago. A woman named Anna had died on her wedding day in a car accident on her way to meet her husband. Since then, people reported seeing her spirit wandering the cemetery, still dressed in her wedding gown, forever waiting for the husband she never reunited with. And from that night on, I understood that some souls remained trapped forever in the memories of a love that never found closure. On rainy nights, I still imagine that bride standing in the rain, endlessly waiting as if her love story will never find its end. After encountering the bride waiting at her grave, I began to realize that perhaps I would never escape these mysterious and dark tales. But rather than running away, I started to accept the presence of these forgotten souls and the mysteries they left behind. I began to seek out places known for strange stories, a way to face my fears and perhaps bring peace to lost spirits. One rainy night, I visited a small town where there was an ancient castle. This castle had stood for centuries, and locals said that on rainy nights, the sound of a piano could be heard playing from inside, even though no one had lived there for years. Curiosity led me to the castle as rain began to fall. I carried a flashlight and held a faint hope that I might understand the story of this place. Upon entering, I felt a chill and darkness that seemed to pervade the space. The stone walls and ancient pillars exuded the scent of time itself. Suddenly, from somewhere in the shadows, a piano melody drifted through the air. It was a sorrowful tune, each note flowing from the player's heart, filled with pain and despair. I stood still, feeling emotions surge within me. This melody felt like the cry of a trapped soul, someone lost in the loop of memories. I followed the sound, moving through dim hallways, each step taking me deeper into the castle. In a large room with a piano in the corner, I saw the figure of a man seated at the instrument. He wore old-fashioned clothing, his face pale, yet his hands moved gracefully over the keys. "Who are you?" I asked softly, though I knew he didn't belong to this world. The man did not turn, continuing to play his haunting melody. His voice drifted out, weak and distant. "I am the one who lost everything here. Love, life. I gave everything to music, and this is the only place left to me." I realized then that he was a musician who had once lived in this castle, a man who had devoted his life to his art. But for some reason, his soul could not leave. He was trapped here with the piano as his only companion, eternally playing a sad tune as a lament for his unfulfilled life. Is there anything I can do to help you? I asked, feeling a deep sympathy. He paused, finally turning to look at me. His eyes were filled with indescribable sorrow, a longing to be freed. If someday someone listens to my music and understands my pain, perhaps I will find peace. I nodded, promising that I would remember his melody and share his story. A glimmer of hope crossed his eyes and his figure gradually faded, dissolving into the air as though he had found a moment of peace. As I left the castle, the rain outside continued to fall, each raindrop mingling with the lingering notes of his melody in my mind. I knew that, like the other souls I had met, the musician would continue playing that tune, forever waiting for someone to listen and understand his sorrow. Each soul I've met, each story I've heard, has left me with unforgettable memories. They are messages from those who have passed on, unfinished loves, endless waiting. It seems this world exists not only in the present, but intertwined with fragments of the past, with souls who have yet to rest, remaining to tell their stories. And when night falls, when the rain patters down, I will continue my journey, seeking and listening to the stories of the lost souls. Join me for more stories in the upcoming episodes, as we continue exploring this mysterious world that emerges only when the lights dim and darkness takes over. See you in the next episode.